Okay, thank you very much for coming, everyone, to my Dharma talk here in beautiful Zhangzhung for a change. Today we're going to be discussing the Cakkavati Sihanada Sutta, which is the 26th sutta in our series of talks on the suttas of the Digha Nikaya, the first book of the Sutta Pitaka, which is in turn, of course, the oldest texts of early Buddhism. So today it's Sutta 26, the Cakkavati Sihanada Sutta. The motif of the lion's roar, the Sihanada, which also refers to a brave speech. The Pali English Dictionary has a song of ecstasy, a shout of exaltation, recurs frequently throughout the Digha Nikaya. It appears in the title of three suttas, 8, 25, and 26. It is used to refer to the Buddha Vachana and the certainty that it creates, and it is also used ironically. The second division of the Majjhima Nikaya, consisting of 10 suttas, is also called the Lion's Roar, as are two suttas in the set, numbers 11 and 12. The metaphor is obvious. Just as the lion is the lord of the forest, so too is the Buddha the lord of the Sangha. Nanamoli and Bodhi say that, quote, a lion's roar, quoting, a lion's roar, according to M.A., is a roar of supremacy and fearlessness, a roar that cannot be confuted, unquote. In addition, the Buddha is reputed to be descended from the sun, and the lion is a universal solar symbol. The great lion's roar, which is sutta number 8 in the Digha Nikaya, and therefore we've covered it earlier, demonstrates the Buddha's claim to Buddhahood and his path being the supreme Dharma. In the great lion's roar to the Udambarakans, which is number 25 in the Digha Nikaya, the Buddha proclaims the true Dharma that transcends the Dharma of the wanderers. In addition, in the lion's roar on the turning of the wheel, number 26 of the Digha Nikaya, the Buddha reveals the secret of how to access the power of the Dharma that confers emancipation. That is, of course, the current sutta that we're discussing today. This sutta feels like a manual, much like the greater discourse on the foundations of mindfulness, sutta number 22. We find the Buddha in Matula, Magadha. This place is not described in the sutta, nor have I been able to find out anything about it, other than that it was a town. Here the Buddha recites his famous pronouncement, which highlights and distills similar expressions that we have found expressed elsewhere in the suttas. Quote, "Monks, be islands unto yourselves, be a refuge unto yourselves with no other refuge. Let the Dhamma be your island, let the Dhamma be your refuge with no other refuge." Unquote. Walsh notes that there is a possibility that the word Pali Dipa, translated island, Sanskrit Dwipa, in this passage may actually mean lamp, Sanskrit Dipa. The word also means help, support, which actually seems to be the most plausible meaning given the subsequent reference to refuge. It's also possible that the Buddha was employing a double entendre. The Buddha then asks, how does one dwell as a refuge unto oneself? The answer is that the monastic observes the four attentions. We have discussed these in connection with the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, which is number 22 in the Digha Nikaya. These consist in cultivating naked attention directed toward the body, feelings, mind, and mind objects. He then concludes with the following advice, quote, "Keep to your own preserves," the Pali word is gokare, monks. Keep to your own preserves, monks. To your ancestral haunts, the Pali word is petike visaye. If you do so, then Mara will find no lodgment, no foothold. It is just by the building up of wholesome states that this merit increases, unquote. What is the Buddha actually saying here? I was intrigued by the phrases pastures and ancestral haunts in Walsh's translation, And so I decided to look a bit more deeply into these words. Gokara means suitable place. Similarly, Visaya means locality, and Petaka from Peta, gone before, means paternal. The Buddha may be alluding to the forest, the traditional residence of Buddhist monastics, which the Buddha recommends frequently throughout the Pali Canon, the implication being that in the absence of temptations, good states and merit increase. This is the actual end of the sutta, to which, as we have seen a few times before, a story has been spliced on, in this case with no segue whatsoever. Then after the story, there is a conclusion to the sutta proper. The story concerns a king called Dalhanemi, described as, quote, a righteous monarch of the law, conqueror of the four quarters, who had established the security of his realm and was possessed of the seven treasures, unquote. We've encountered a wheel-turning monarch before, being King Mahasuddasana of Kusinara, made famous for Ananda's calling it, quote, a miserable little town of wattle and daub, shortly before the Buddha's death in the Mahasuddasana Sutta, which is number 17 in the Digha Nikaya. We discussed the meaning of the seven treasures in connection with that sutta. Here, as there, we are mainly interested in the wheel treasure. When the wheel treasure slips from its position, quote-unquote, an interesting concept when one considers that the wheel treasure is hovering above the palace, but that's what the text says. When the wheel treasure slips from its position, the king will die soon. The king appoints his eldest son, the crown prince, to take over running the state, and joins the Sangha in anticipation of his death. 7 days later, the wheel treasure vanishes. His son goes to the royal sage, that is the previous king, his predecessor, and tells him that the wheel treasure has vanished. The king explains that the wheel treasure is not a hereditary possession, but that his son must earn it. If he does so, then on the Uposatha day, you recall that that's the day of the new and full moon, the so-called Buddhist Sabbath. On the Uposatha day, that wheel treasure may appear to him too. Incidentally, for those who might have seen Scorsese's movie Kundan about the young Dalai Lama, you may remember a golden wheel, quite large and heavy-looking, which was presented to the Dalai Lama at his coronation. This is a representation of the wheel treasure, which identifies the Dalai Lama as a royal sage. Sometimes this is also translated as prince priest. The duty of a wheel-turning monarch is fivefold. To 1, honor the Dharma by maintaining the state based on the legal, ethical, and political philosophy of the Buddhas. 2, establish the security of the state, including protecting the environment, and that is explicit in the suttas. It is the role of the king or the government of a Buddhist king or government to protect the environment, specifically birds and beasts, as it's expressed in the sutta. 3, establish justice. 4, provide welfare for those in need. And 5, advise the Sangha on matters of practical policy. Thus, it is explicit that Buddhism, like Islam, is a political spiritual philosophy, not merely spiritual. In fact, most spiritual philosophies have some sort of political implication, but in the case of Buddhism and Islam, it is explicit. The equal emphasis on security, justice, and welfare sounds positively modern. The role of the wheel-turning monarch in connection with ethics is interesting. The king seems to be a supremely enlightened householder, whose legal and ethical character is ideally, of course, unimpeachable, so that in relation to the Sangha, he exercises the role of a worldly advisor, much like a chaplain, but in reverse. This establishes once again what the Buddha also established by making the Sangha dependent on the people for alms, so that the Sangha would always be subject to the people and not the reverse. The Buddha was not trying to establish a theocracy, and in fact it's quite clear throughout the Pali Canon that the Buddha was in fact a democrat. King Dalhanemi's son rules righteously, and one day when the king is on his veranda at the top of his palace, after having washed his head, an interesting detail concerning observing the Uposatha. I don't know if that is a general observance or something specific to the king, but in any case, he's washed his head and gone to the top of his palace in order to observe the Uposatha, and the wheel treasure appears to him. Quote, "The sacred wheel treasure appeared to him 1,000-spoked, complete with felloe, hub, and all appurtenances," unquote. Those of you who attended my talk on Sutta 17 will remember how King Mahasuddasana conquered his neighbors peacefully through the power of Dharma, led on by the wheel treasure, which appeared as a luminous flying object that guided him from place to place as though it had intelligence. Here the story is basically the same. The story is clearly an allegory for the idea of the power of the state being governed by ethics, identified with Dharma, and expanding to include neighboring states under the same regimen, thus eventually establishing a Pacific global Dharma empire, entirely without violence. King Dalhanemi's Dharma society was based on 6 precepts. Do not kill, do not take what is not given, do not commit sexual misconduct, do not tell lies, do not drink strong drink, and be moderate in eating. Establishing a society based on these principles is less obvious than first appears. Our society, for example, violates every one of them, thus bringing upon itself the same karma that it imposes on others and has done for quite a long time. Moderation in eating is, of course, one of the most important precepts of the Vinaya for the monastics. The story reminds me of the story of Moses bringing down the tablets of the law in Exodus, in the Jewish tradition, of course, well, Judeo-Christian tradition. King Dalhanemi's son dies and is succeeded by a succession of wheel-turning kings, being 7 in all. The text does not count King Dalhanemi himself as one. The last royal sage in this succession, which obviously lasted many thousands, perhaps even millions of years, and I have a note on this point. Just give me one moment to find it. There we go. The period implied between successive appearances of the wheel treasure is described as many hundreds and thousands of years, quote unquote. The minimum, therefore, is 4,400 years, and the maximum is just shy of 1,000,000 years. 8 periods are implied from the accession of Dalhanemi to the accession of his 7th successor. The minimum possible time implied then is 8 times 4,400 equals 35,200 years. The maximum then is slightly less than 8 million years. Just give me one moment to find my spot. Sorry about that. There we go. So the last royal sage in the succession is told that the wheel treasure had slipped from its position. In accordance with the custom, the royal sage ordains in the Sangha and prepares to die. 7 days later, the wheel treasure disappears. The 8th successor does not consult his predecessor concerning the duties of a wheel-turning monarch. Instead, he decides to govern based on his own views, resulting in an overall reduction of the prosperity of the people. Clearly, the Buddha is interested in economic ways of thinking. In response to the criticism of his ministers and others, he consults them on the duties of a wheel-turning monarch, and based on their advice, he establishes guard and protection, quote-unquote, is the way the Sutta expresses it, but he does not establish a welfare system. A conservative, presumably. As a result, the Buddha traces a logical progression similar to other progressions we've studied in connection with the Paticcasamuppada, in which not giving property to the needy results in widespread stealing. Because of the increase in stealing, the king is forced to give property to those who steal. As a result, an epidemic of stealing breaks out. The Buddha clearly understands the intricacies of effective statecraft and the concept of unintended consequences, in addition to the law of karma. In response to the epidemic of stealing, the king institutes beheading, a punishment to which we have also alluded in a past talk. As a result, people begin to steal other people's property and cut off their heads, resulting in gangsterism. This appears to be a response to the kings cutting off the heads of the criminals. So the criminals turn around and say, well, if you're going to do that to us, we're going to cut off the heads of our victims, which also has the advantage, of course, in killing the witnesses. As a result, the longevity and beauty of the people falls. Over time, the lifespan, and I'm going to put that in very big quotes. Please note when I say lifespan, I am putting that in quotation marks. Over time, the lifespan falls from 80,000 to 10 years. We have discussed this longevity cycle in previous talks too. Also, lying, gossip, adultery, and sexual misconduct, harsh speech and idle chatter, covetousness and hatred, false opinions, incest, greed, deviant practices, and lack of respect for authority have all been progressively increasing all through historical times. Incidentally, I don't take this human longevity index ranging from 80,000 to 10 years and back again any more literally than I take the gross domestic product. The way I take it is that these numbers are indicators of the overall quality of life, of which longevity is only one representation. Quality of life is expressed in years as a convention, similar to bond durations in finance, for those of you who are into investing and or financial planning. Miccha Dhamma is translated by Walsh as deviant practices, apparently influenced by the commentary, remembering that the commentaries were written hundreds of years after the suttas themselves. The dictionary definition of Dhamma is doctrine, nature, truth, the norm, morality, good conduct. Miccha is untruth, falsehood, false, wrongly, wrong. To my ear, deviant practices has a connotation that is not borne out by these definitions. False beliefs or wrong behavior seems like a more accurate rendering. This brings us to the extended present of history, when the human lifespan is about 100 years. Interestingly, although we have a conceit in our society that the human lifespan has been increasing, in fact, historical studies have shown that the actual human lifespan, in the sense of the maximum longevity of human beings, has not changed much in the last 2,500 years. The statistical life expectancy has increased as a result of the reduction in infant mortality, but the actual age to which people who survive infancy live has remained about the same for the last 2,500 years. According to the Buddhist worldview, the continuing decline of Dharma will result in a future deterioration in the quality of human life, till human morality itself disappears and humans revert to the animal state. Quote, all will be promiscuous in the world, like goats and sheep, fowl and pigs, dogs and jackals. Among them, fierce enmity will prevail, one for another, fierce hatred, fierce anger, and thoughts of killing, mother against child and child against mother, father against child and child against father, brother against brother, brother against sister, just as the hunter feels hatred for the beast he stalks, unquote. You'll notice that the progression in this succession of world-turning monarchs, beginning with 80,000 years, falls at a regular rate from 80,000 to 40,000, 20,000, 10,000, 5,000, 2,500 or 2,000, 1,000, 500, 250 or 200, and 100 years. Each step represents a halving, with a break at 2,500 and 250, where the text states some beings only lived for 2,000 and 200 years respectively, thus allowing the halving to continue. Between 100 and 10 years, the steps are left out, but can be inferred as 50 25, or 20 and 10. Since the duration between the ages must be equal to the ages themselves, since each world-ruling monarch succeeds each other on his predecessor's death, and assuming, of course, that each monarch lives out a full lifespan, change accelerates exponentially as the lifespans fall. And I just have a note on that. Based on the Sutta, the total duration of an antarkapa, that's the name for a kappa or age during which human lifespan falls from 80,000 to 10 years and then rises again back to 80,000 years. If you add up those numbers, it works out to 314,695 years, divided into devolutionary and evolutionary arcs of roughly 160,000 years each, despite the traditional view that it is incalculable. It is interesting to note, therefore, that the earliest known fossil of Homo sapiens, our own species, is just about 160,000 years old. 320,000 years ago marks fundamental advancements in tool-making and the first evidence for regular use of fire and the burial of the dead. Perhaps the absurd longevities given in the Pali Canon are not so absurd if we regard them as referring to ages of humanity rather than to ages of individual humans. And there's a link in the blog version of this talk that you can go and take a look at if you're interested in more information on the 160,000 year cycle in particular. If we regard the numbers as an arithmetical expression of historical devolution, the stepped character of the transforms suggests a cataclysmic rather than a continuous view of history, characterized by intermittent episodes of rapid change, which is now the dominant model of biological evolution. When I was a younger man, 20, 30, 40 years ago, the idea, which was associated with a fellow by the name of Velikovsky and also with occultism, that human history and also biological history was cataclysmic, was regarded as nonsense. The dominant view was that it was essentially continuous. This view has now changed very much in the last 10 or 20 years. And I have put a video on this topic in the blog version of this talk, which if you're interested in seeing an actual depiction of current thinking on this question, you can watch this very excellent nature video. The nadir, or bottom of this process, is the advent of the Satta Nantarkapa, which is a compound of Pali Satta plus Antarkapa, when the majority of human beings will kill each other off in a very short time, quote, mistaking one another for wild beasts, unquote, as the text says, nearly destroying human civilization. This enantiodromia, or reversal, is designated by the term Satta Nantarkapa. Walsh translates this as sword interval, but the primary meaning of Satta is science, interestingly. We may therefore translate the name of, with impunity as the age of science. And thus we might identify the sword interval with the scientific revolution. The word Satta is also related to Sanskrit swasta, related to swastika, referring perhaps to the Nazi Holocaust, in which approximately 11 million people were slaughtered like animals, and the generally destructive anti-human effects of the ideology of scientific materialism, which includes philosophical materialism, Newtonian science, industrialism, social Darwinism, communism, fascism, capitalism, scientism, and technocracy. Interestingly, Nazism managed to combine all those things into a single ideology. And of course, the Nazis were well known for their scientists. In fact, it was a secret for a long time. It's recently been declassified. You can look it up in Wikipedia under the heading Operation Paperclip, that the Americans brought a significant number of Nazi scientists to the United States to work on their space program, and gave them legal exemption from the consequences of their acts in Nazi Germany. So the effects of scientific material, the ideology of scientific materialism, are still very much with us and are by no means past. We are therefore technically still in this fascist period, dominated by the reptilian or asura mode of consciousness that has come to dominate the ego as a result of the collapse of the transcendent function. Just give me one moment to find my spot. There we go. Clearly, we are currently living in the descending arc of this cycle. And when I say clearly, I mean based on the texts. That's not my interpretation. The texts make it quite clear that we are living in the descending arc of this cycle. There is a common view that a Buddha always appears at the nadir or bottom of the historical cycle. However, this is not borne out by the texts. For the duration of the sword interval, a remnant of those humans who eschew violence will survive in remote, inhospitable, and inaccessible places. After the majority of the race has destroyed each other, these people will emerge and establish a new civilization based on the precepts of the Dharma, which has clearly not been forgotten. Interestingly, this is exactly the scenario that resulted in the emergence of mammals, including Homo sapiens, or our ancestor, including the ancient ancestor Homo sapiens, as a result of the fifth mass extinction about 65 million years before the present. Obviously without the Dharma, but the structure of the widespread destruction and then a minority group or species or race emerging in order to establish a new cycle of civilization, that is the classic pattern associated with the five mass extinctions that have preceded the current time, which is referred to by scientists as the sixth mass extinction. That is, of course, the extinction that our own species is perpetrating upon the planet now as a result of its population growth and industrial activities. As a result, the longevity, and again we're putting that in quotes, increases from 10 to 80,000 years. At the end of this evolutionary arc, greed, fasting, and old age will be the only diseases known. Jambudvipa, or in Sanskrit, that's Jambudvipa, the Indian subcontinent, which is identified with the realm of humans and the Dharma itself, will be powerful and prosperous, with numerous highly populated villages, towns, and cities. Using the same methodology as above, the time from the sword interval to the beginning of the final phase of the evolutionary arc is about 80,000 years in the future, after the age of science, a 144-year interval that occurred between about 1543 and 1687. And I just have a note on that. To justify those years, I just have a quotation from the Wikipedia, quote, "While its dates are disputed, the publication in 1543 of Nicholas Copernicus's De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres is often cited as marking the beginning of the scientific revolution, and its completion is attributed to the grand synthesis of Newton's 1687 Principia." So that's from the article on scientific revolution in the Wikipedia. If we identify this period with the sword interval, then we must consider ourselves to be on the threshold of the evolutionary arc. Further population die-offs and economic disruptions seem probable because of climate change and environmental devastation generally, with the possibility of local nuclear attacks or accidents always present. This process has already begun, of course. The First World War saw 16,403,000 casualties. The Second World War saw 12 million dead. The Holocaust added another 11 million. To this we must add the slave trade, the modern history of which began in the 17th century, not long after the advent of finance capitalism. Essentially the two things arose together, and which has afflicted untold millions right up until the present day. It seems we are all hell-bent on destroying the planet and each other as soon as possible. It also seems that the only way to stop this is a global catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. The age, perhaps roughly 80,000 years hence, when humanity has finally achieved greatly enhanced human longevity, disease is nearly unknown, and prosperity is universal, characterized by high-density housing and a large population with many cities. The text says that, literally, that it is as crowded as hell, will be a veritable golden age. Women will enter puberty at the equivalent age of 1 year. This vision is, of course, exactly the scientific utopian vision of the future, which one also finds in the Kalachakra prophecies concerning the Dharma society of the future Shambhala. This may surprise those who believe in a kind of neo-Taoist Buddhism of return to nature, though the two views are not necessarily incompatible. There is a common view that Buddhas make their appearance near the nadir of human civilization. While this was true of Gautama, it was not true of the Buddhas before him, nor will it be true of Maitreya. The Sanskrit name is Maitreya, the coming Buddha, who will appear during the age of the 80,000-year lifespan, in quotes, at the zenith of human civilization. And I should say, even technically, the Buddha did not appear at the nadir of human civilization, although he appeared close to it, 100 compared to 10 years. But in the case of Maitreya, it's the exact opposite. He appears at the zenith of human civilization. Says the Sutta, quote, "In that time of the people with an 80,000-year lifespan, there will arise in the world a blessed Lord, an arahant, fully enlightened Buddha named Maitreya, endowed with wisdom and conduct, a welfare, knower of the worlds, incomparable trainer of men to be tamed, teacher of gods, that is to say of devas and humans, enlightened and blessed, just as I am now." It's the Buddha speaking, of course. "He will thoroughly know by his own super-knowledge and proclaim this universe with its devas and maras and brahmas, its ascetics and brahmins, and this generation with its princes and people, just as I do now. He will teach the Dhamma, lovely in its beginning, lovely in its middle, lovely in its ending, in the spirit and in the letter, and proclaim, just as I do now, the holy life in its fullness and purity. He will be attended by a company of thousands of monks, just as I am attended by a company of hundreds." Unquote. Many people throughout history have identified themselves with Maitreya, beginning with Wu Zetian, who lived between 624 and 705, the only ruling female emperor in the history of China, who ruthlessly persecuted her opponents in the royal family by cutting off their arms and legs and inserting them in jars, and most recently by Ram Bahadur Bamjan, born in 1990, a Nepalese nicknamed Buddha Boy, of whom you may have heard. He actually has quite a coverage on the internet. However, it is clear, disregarding the improbably extended longevity of human beings, that the essential conditions of Maitreya's coming, namely a global die-off, a global human die-off, followed by a cultural revolution, the establishment of a Dharma society, and the appearance of a universal golden age, have yet to be fulfilled. Therefore, technically, Maitreya cannot have come yet, according to the Pali Canon. According to the Sutta, all of these conditions are preconditions of Maitreya's appearance, not the result of it. Another mistake that's easy to make. Maitreya will teach the Buddha Dharma in its perfection, both exoteric and esoteric, but his Sangha will be 10 times larger than that of Gautama. So let's see, I think currently there's about 500 million Buddhists in the world, so multiply that by 10. This will only come about in accordance with the law of karma when the conditions are right. The Buddha reiterates the advice to the monastics to be refuges unto themselves, with no other refuge than the Dharma itself. Once again, the Buddha emphasizes that emancipation is an endeavor of, for, and by the individual. One is not saved by anyone or anything outside of oneself, which raises an interesting quandary for those who believe that the Buddha denied the existence of a self as distinct from a certain sort of a self or a certain way of seeing the self. He even says that the individual alone is their own refuge, with no other refuge, a startling thought given the great religious solemnity of the threefold refuge, that is to say, refuge, the familiar formula, I take refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Have Buddhists been taking refuge in the wrong thing all this time? Taking refuge in oneself is then identified with taking refuge in the Dharma. Note the singularity of this formula. Taking refuge in the Dharma, and in the Buddha and the Sangha rather, taking refuge in the Buddha and the Sangha are not mentioned. Some scholars have observed that there appear to be references to a unitary refuge formula in the Pali Canon, in which one takes refuge in the Dharma only, which is consistent with this advice and similar advice expressed in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. The threefold formula appears to be a later innovation as Buddhism became more focused on the deification of the Buddha on the one hand, and as the Sangha was establishing its hegemony on the other. And there is a footnote, I'm not going to read it here, but there's a footnote in the version, the blog version of this talk, if you're interested in looking up a scholarly reference for this discussion of the unitary refuge formula versus the threefold refuge formula. I've given a scholarly reference in the online version of the blog for those who are interested in pursuing it further. He then reiterates the four attentions and the ancestral haunts, which of course we've already discussed. By remaining in the forest, according to my interpretation of ancestral haunts, and I think it is the correct interpretation, the Buddha says that the quality of life, beauty, happiness, wealth, and power will all increase. Note those particular qualities, the quality of life, beauty, happiness, wealth, and power, an interesting set of objectives for a monastic. Each of these attainments seems to be associated with a specific practice or set of related practices. Presumably, then, these are the practices in which a forest-dwelling monastic engages in order to produce the fruits described in the Sutta, which of course raises the question of what is being referred to here, particularly with reference to beauty, wealth, and power. Specifically, quality of life is attained by a set of four related practices called the Four Roads to Power. Beauty is attained by right conduct. Happiness is attained by the cultivation of detachment. Wealth is attained by the cultivation of loving kindness. And finally, power is attained by a practice called the liberation of heart and wisdom. It seems that the Buddha has adapted these four goals, since beauty, wealth, and power seem rather ill-suited to monastics. Thus, the Buddha asks, what do these goals mean for a monastic? The Buddha did adapt a significant number of ideas and practices from his Indian heritage, of course. He was not a tabula rasa, unlike the wish of some Sri Lankan academics who would like to divorce the Buddha from his Indian heritage. I'm thinking particularly of, for example, of the Sri Lankan academic Suwanda H.J. Sigunasiri, who has developed a frankly racist interpretation of Buddhism in which he attempts to exclude everything Indian from the Pali Canon. Those of you who attended my talk on the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, which is the 19th sutta in the Digha Nikaya, may remember the Buddha's comment to Ananda that had Ananda asked him to do so, the Buddha could have overcome his illness by an effort of will and lived out his full human lifespan of about 100 years. This is the current interpretation of that passage. In older translations of the sutta, you may see that the translator has interpreted the Buddha to be saying that he could live to the end of the age. which would be a period of thousands, if not millions of years. The kappa may refer to the age, or it may refer to the human lifespan. Most scholars today, most translators today take the view that he was actually referring to the human lifespan, not the duration of an age. Nevertheless, the technique by which this may be accomplished is called the road to power, also known as the four roads to power, which is also described in Sutta 18. So we have actually seen this meditation practice before. This was broken down into 4 specific concentration exercises. 1, concentration of intention. 2, concentration of energy. 3, concentration of consciousness. And 4, concentration of investigation. According to the text, each exercise is accompanied by an effort of will. Perhaps this is as good a place as any to mention that while this and other meditative practices are alluded to in the Pali Canon, the actual methods are only discussed in the briefest possible way. We get a structural outline of the practices, but rarely more than that. Clearly, the techniques were more detailed in practice. The practice of the techniques must have been more detailed, and the texts must have been supplemented by verbal instructions that were given by the Buddha, presumably, or his disciples directly to the monastics. This shows that the Pali Canon is not complete, but is merely a compilation of teachings that must have been elaborated in detail when the actual exercises were taught to the monastics. And this is a standard approach in the Indian tradition. Alternatively, the absence of details might also imply that the redactors of the Pali Canon themselves were beginning to forget the details. Unfortunately, this aspect of the oral tradition has been largely lost to us over the course of time. David Chapman discusses this in the context of the Theravada sect in his blog Theravada Reinvents Meditation. And if you're interested in looking at that article, it's a very excellent article and very interesting. Again, if you go to the blog version of this talk, you'll find there's a hyperlink there. You can click it and read David Chapman's article on how the Theravada is essentially a 19th century and early 20th century reinvention of early Buddhism or ancient Buddhism. The road to power is especially interesting because it shows that at least some Buddhist meditations were not directed towards the direct attainment of enlightenment, but were concerned with the acquisition of the so-called iddhi, psychic attainments, or even magical powers. This is why the later traditions have so much of value to contribute, because they represent the fruits and insights of actual practice, instead of a faded collective memory. Before I mentioned that beauty, wealth, and power seem to be peculiar goals for a monk. Thus, the Buddha reinterprets beauty as right conduct, by which the rules of training are perfected. Happiness is interpreted as detachment by the Buddha, which is perfected by the practice of the 4 jhanas. We've covered the 4 jhanas in previous talks. I'm not going to go into them further here. Wealth is another of these surprising goals, which is reinterpreted by the Buddha as loving kindness, the familiar metta meditation, by which the monastic suffuses the whole world with compassion. And again, we've discussed the metta meditation before. We're not going to go into it further in this talk. Finally, the Buddha identifies power with the destruction, which is the last step, with the destruction of the corruptions or taints, consisting of craving for sensual pleasures, craving for existence, and ignorance, to which attachment to views was added by the commentaries. The literal meaning of the word translated as corruptions, asawa, is discharge from a sore. This power is the corruptionless liberation of heart by wisdom. Heart in Pali is chitta, which means a heart and mind. Wisdom referring to the salvific principle itself, as I have mentioned. Heart also suggests calming meditation, wisdom insight meditation, or wisdom based on a serene heart. And of course, therefore, the power to destroy the corruptions is, of course, equivalent to enlightenment itself. So power is, in this meditation, the road to power is both the goal and is equivalent to enlightenment itself. Interestingly, the discussion of the road to power, culminating in power, perhaps empowerment is a better word, culminating in the liberation of the heart by wisdom that is attained by realization, segues directly into a discussion of the power of Mara. The commonality is clearly power, which identifies this practice as proto-tantric in character, one of an increasing number of references which I'm finding in the Pali Canon to what I am choosing to call proto-tantra. Power, the Pali word is bala, in itself is neither enlightened nor unenlightened, both of which are ultimately dualistic concepts. The energy of enlightenment immediately posits the energy of unenlightenment rather, and this anticipates the tantric view of power very accurately. And Tantra is often described as the yoga of power. The Buddha concludes with the statement that merit increases with the accumulation of wholesome states. The phrase translated as wholesome is upaya kaushalya, which literally translated means something closer to effective than the rather indefinite connotations of the English wholesome. That translation has always irritated me. Upaya means something like strategy, whereas kaushalya is skillful or even capable. And you will of course recognize here the familiar translation skillful means, which is how it's often translated. I think we see here another indication of the influence of the mercantile society of the Buddha's time, which was also his largest constituency, in which the Buddha lived, and the influence of mercantilism on Buddhist thinking. Just as Buddhism resolves ethics into the ontological fact of the law of karma, so does it resolve morality into that which works. Buddhist ethics are ultimate pragmatism. Buckminster Fuller declared similarly that a moral or ethical system is simply an empirical fact that developed experientially as the most optimum or efficient human response to the environment. In the case of Buddhism, ethics are embedded in actuality, not in the form of an ought, but in the form of a fundamental ontological fact, the law of causality, that is to say the law of karma, extended to include mind as a sense and mind objects as the objects of the mental sense. Okay, thank you very much. That concludes my talk on the 26th Sutta of the Digha Nikaya, the Cakkavati Sihanada Sutta. And I do see we have a question. I was going to ask if anyone has any questions. Rollo asks, if wealth is equated with metta, then might it mean instead of financial wealth, a wealth or abundance of spiritual energy, or a wealth of enlightenment that allows one, sorry, my window just shut, that allows one to share with others through the act of loving kindness, metta. Yes, that is exactly the reinterpretation that the Buddha has put upon that term. However, the fact that the Buddha, the thing that interests me about this, I don't dispute your interpretation at all, but the thing that interests me about this is the fact that the Buddha felt called upon to make a reinterpretation. The fact that he was compelled to reinterpret these practices in terms of monasticism suggests to me that this was in fact an Indian householder practice that the Buddha encountered, liked, saw the virtues of, and adapted to the Sangha for his own purposes, as he did with many Indian practices. It's not an unusual thing at all. Otherwise, there's no particular reason why he would have used those terms. If this was an original practice which the Buddha created, why would he use those terms? The fact that he's using these worldly terms suggests to me that this was in fact a worldly practice, a householder practice, a kind of yoga designed to obtain those very things, but that the Buddha saw virtue in it and adapted it to his own philosophy. That's what interests me about that. Okay, before we conclude with the, Rollo says, I think I see what you mean. He, the Buddha, may have been correcting worldly practice of the time. Well, correcting, yes, correcting in terms of his own philosophy, yes. And you see this elsewhere in the Pali Canon too. There are other practices which the Buddha has taken and then recast in his own terms. So, before we conclude with the dedication of merit, whereby we dedicate the merit of this talk to all beings, does anyone have any further questions about, discussion about anything in this sutta? Let's give you 15 seconds or so. Okay, there don't seem to be any further questions, so let's conclude with the dedication of merit. Whatever understanding, whatever positive forces come from this, may it go deeper and deeper and act as a cause to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all. Once again, thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss Dharma. It is my pleasure and privilege. I will return in this series of talks next Sunday at 2 o'clock at the Buddha Center. I'll be giving my talk on the 27th Sutta of the Digha Nikaya in this ongoing series of talks on the 34 Suttas of the Digha Nikaya. Until then, Namaskar.